Hello, Lowell and Tewksbury. Today we have a very special Inside Lowell crossover event with, I believe, Inside Tewksbury. I'm looking to the producer, Teddy. He's not going to be on today. You're going to hear my voice a lot. So this Inside Lowell podcast is coming to you from the WellPoint Studios. WellPoint, the only health plan offering health care benefits exclusively to Massachusetts GIC members. At WellPoint, your whole health is their whole point. I'm very excited today to introduce to you, if you haven't already seen him, his presence is very strong on LinkedIn, Jeff LeBlanc. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
So just for the audience's edification, I found Jeff literally through a Bentley connection, an article that he recently wrote that you published on LinkedIn, but it was published in the Boston Business Journal.
The Boston Business Journal, yep, absolutely.
And I just found it really interesting, and I thought it was a great subject to talk about today, given that our audience is Lowell-based and Tewksbury-based. You wrote an article recently about Market Basket, the current conflict at Market Basket, and kind of how the new generation of employees might be responding a little bit differently than the 2014 employees. So let me start before we dive into that. Okay. Tell me a little bit about yourself, because I know we have that Bentley connection that you're an adjunct there, you're a lecturer there.
A lecturer, yep.
So how did you get into that world, and kind of what are you doing now that led you to that article?
Yep. So my journey to higher ed could be too long to go through the whole thing. It would take the whole podcast. So we'll just say, long story short, I worked at Boston University for a while and then actually ended up with a great opportunity at Bentley. I love Bentley, and I'm there full time as a lecturer. Good. And teaching's my focus. Yep, absolutely. Bentley. And I love Bentley. And so basically what happened was I started, as I was teaching, I started exploring this area of Generation Z, because I was a millennial and I was teaching Generation Z, and I was hearing a lot of things about the generation, just, they were lazy, or they weren't, didn't want to work, and these sorts of things. And so that led me to start researching them, and, because I was working with them daily and seeing sort of, I think, a different side, right? Because I was working at various schools as an adjunct for a long time. That's how I got started in higher ed. And ultimately, that all led to me sort of publishing some work and sort of, what I've found and leadership model and different things. And so what led to me writing this piece was that I just feel that this is going to be not just, I think there's a national way to look at it as well, but I think especially with this local, because like you said, it's a very local story and very compelling. I thought the 2014, situation was so fascinating. Absolutely. Right?
Yeah.
And so my first thought was, I think this is going to be different, or I think it could be different. Let's see if I can write something about this.
Okay.
And that's pretty much what I did, basing it off of speaking to some Gen Z employees, even expanding to other generations as well to sort of get their perspective, but also what I sort of have observed over those years.
Okay.
So that's sort of the roundabout way of how I got there.
No, and I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, I was an adjunct at a community college for a little while. So some of your articles, I did kind of a deeper dive into, and I read some of the other stuff you wrote. I loved that you were encouraging people to go to country music concerts, by the way, because I was country before country was cool. I have 4 children who are 22, 21, 18, and 15, and they're kind of my basis. We've had, prior to being in Inside Lowell, I was on WCAP, and I would always reference, especially during kind of the election season, the observations of especially my 3 older children, because they were kind of getting to that age of being voter age, and being concerned that, with social media influence, kind of believing things that might not necessarily be fact, just because that's what their feed was telling them. So that's, I think, when I first read your article, I immediately went to kind of the mother bear, thinking of my kids, thinking of them as they start exploring employment and career paths. And also thinking of my students when I used to teach. I am a Gen X. I think my husband would say I'm more of a boomer mindset, but I am a Gen X. I work with, I think, boomers to to Gen Zs
Yep.
at this point. My youngest, I would consider, she likes to call herself a Gen Alpha.
Yeah,
And
I think she probably is, right? 'Cause
Yes, yep.
yeah.
And she just applied for her very first job at Market Basket. My very first paycheck job was Market Basket. So I think
Interesting.
yes. And one of the things that I find amazing, there's so many different ways that we can have this discussion about Market Basket. But one of the things I find so interesting is when you go into your favorite Market Basket, and we all have that one that's ours, right? So mine's Store 22 in Tewksbury, Oakdale. That's the one we go to. You see people that have been there for a million years.
Right.
The familiar face, the bagger that has been retired, but he's been working there for 20 years. And you see the 15-year-old, 14-year-old kid, it's their very first job, right?
Right.
And we all kind of have that idea that it's a family-based company, even though in reality, it's almost an $8 billion company with 90 locations, and it's kind of grown beyond, I think I was trying to research the history, 1917, I think. Demula started in Lowell.
I believe so.
Something like that.
It's
certainly
around there.
Yeah, family based, and then we expand, and now it really is this corporation, but it still has that family feel. So I think one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about that I find so interesting is, you ended that article by basically saying you thought this would be different than 2014. And you said that it's because the Gen Zs might have a different approach. Do you think it's also, I guess my first kind of question is, do you think what's happening at Market Basket is different in that we're not getting as much information? In 2014, we knew RDT was being fired, and there was a bunch of, calls to loyalty and calls to action pretty much even before he was fired. I think like the first picketing actually started like in 2013 leading up to it, right?
Right.
This time around, we're not getting as much info. Do you think Gen Z requires, I guess, more or the same info, or how do you think they process kind of what's going on around them?
So I think one of the things that sort of like from a business perspective, and you probably would say the same thing, that this situation seems quite different, right? Because obviously this is a now where, the information we're being given, this is not cousin versus cousin like it was before. It's sort of brother versus sisters,
right? Which would be, it's like a Greek version of Succession. Patty will love that. I don't know.
Yes.
Again, I might be,
Yeah, it is.
It's just amazing. I would love to be in the boardroom watching it all go down.
Exactly. And so now I think, obviously it sort of benefited that side of the family in 2014 to sort of back everything, and sort of, you never know, I guess, sort of how something truly gets kickstarted.
Right.
But like you said, we were seeing that. Now there's probably more reason to keep that. Obviously, some people have argued it will be mostly fought out in courtrooms and what have you. And whatever happens, who knows? But to your Generation Z, question, I think that because so much has changed, I think one of the things is, one of the students that I spoke to, they were a student, college student and an employee, and they said that, they don't even remember the 2014 situation.
Right.
They have no memory of it. And they also don't have a connection to RDT. Yep. Which, and like they said, they didn't have any bad, they hadn't heard anything bad, but they were sort of like, thinking, why would it be on us to sort of save a company where I don't even know the history here?
Okay.
Right. So what that led me to believe is, if there is sort of going back to what I study with the older generation, like you said, you go into a Market Basket, you could have 5 generations, you could have a lot of people, right? Maybe it's not as, and again, this is speculation, but I wonder if it's not as tight knit as perhaps with the younger generation. You know what I mean? Because that's what we're seeing a lot in the workplaces, right? Younger generations not connecting, especially with like a baby boomer or someone along those lines, or even potentially a millennial, right? Because they're not as online focused, social media focused, whatever it may be. And I'm not saying any generation's better than the other. That's not my thought process. Yep. But I do wonder about that, because, you're just not, you don't seem to be seeing that same sort of level of outrage or level of, let's rise up and do this. And I even sort of looked through Reddit and try to find if like Reddit threads, right, to see, because that's a great place to do some journalism, right? That's always safe.
Right.
But nevertheless, so, and you see some people say like, let's rise up for Market Basket, and there'll be like a few comments,
right?
And then there might be a few people say, well, no, I have, this to do or that to do. So maybe the sentiment's changed,
right.
But I do think that the generational element plays a role.
Well, and so I guess that begs the bigger question, right? Because you kind of hit the nail a little bit on like where I was thinking about it as well. Is you said, a lot of the kids today might not even really know who RDT is. They don't remember 2014. They don't remember that uprising. And have you, and just kind of expanding beyond Market Basket for a minute, do you find like in corporate culture in general that there's kind of that more, I don't want to say disconnect, but just more distance between kind of like the C-suite and the worker bees, in that, they might not necessarily feel the same level of loyalty to a company because they don't really know, like they know who their supervisor is, and they might even know who their supervisor is. But at the end of the day, they're not tracking the chain of command to know who they're actually like the ultimate employer is. Do you find that in your studies or in your research?
Well, that's what's so interesting, is because I do think that younger generations almost want that in a way, right? I think to a certain age point, I don't know where, I think even honestly, millennials, for me, we sort of got a job and didn't necessarily, we sort of go with the flow, so to speak, right? And didn't necessarily question things as much. At least I didn't. A lot of people I speak to didn't. Meeting the CEO probably might not even have been on our mind. But of course, that's what made Market Basket, I think, so unique, right? Because he was on the right there, so to speak. But I think with Gen Z, that we're seeing, at least in terms of self-advocacy, they're very big proponents of that. They're very much, let's go in and, advocate for ourselves. And I encourage that. So I'm, I guess, to blame or one of the people to blame. But it can be good, I think, but I do think that, that is part of it. I think that, here you have a situation where they feel like, well, maybe why haven't I met this person, right? Or why haven't I heard about this person? I'm hearing these stories. It's almost like the folklore of Market Basket, right? That, because you're right, we all have our one, and I won't name my one because I want to it's to keep everything confidential. It's very serious. But ultimately, I do think that you have that situation where there's sort of that question of, well, I haven't had that. I haven't done that. And so I just think that we're in 2014, you probably had that as well, but there was more, I don't know, I think maybe the connection between the employees.
Right.
Because what I think we're seeing with Gen Z is that there is so much, and this is maybe reflective of the world in general, but there is that sort of division in terms of, one of the biggest reasons why I got into this is that I would hear from employers, that almost, I hate to say that they like forfeit, but almost to the point where they were like, they didn't even want to try, and I just, that was not my experience when I was in entry level type positions. So it seemed like something switched so quickly. And so, I do think that maybe that connection isn't there. And that could be part of it as well.
So it's interesting because there was actually, it literally happened this morning, and it wasn't something I was planning on being a part of this, but I feel like I'm an old curmudgeon now, right? That's why I feel like I could be like the boomer generation, in that kids today comes out of my mouth a lot to my kids. And I do, when you say like you're partly to blame, I feel like, the parents, I know I raised my kids in a generation of everybody gets a trophy, and there's a lot less conflict. And I definitely like a lawnmower / helicopter mom, that I was always trying to clear the obstacles, not realizing I was never having them learn how to lift weights on their own, right? And it got to a point, thankfully, I think within the last few years, as they kind of transitioned to college and now, post-college, that I started realizing I never really taught them kind of the resilience component of it as much. And they might have observed it, because they saw a mom who was working really hard, and trying to provide and doing those things. And I do think, I feel, and this is, I guess, completely off topic for a moment, but I feel like, my generation, especially the females of my generation, we're kind of in a really difficult position because we were raised by working moms. Right. So we got to see like, okay, you can do it all. you can work, you can take care of the house, you can do it all. And hopefully you have a spouse who was raised by a working mom and is going to contribute in a way to help with that, right? Yeah. But I think the flip side of that, the problem with that is we tried to do so much for our kids that they didn't realize what it was like to have to take care of themselves earlier, you know. And here they are, like, I was joking, one of my friends was concerned about letting her daughter go to Boston at 18. And I was thinking to myself, you know, when I was 18, my mom didn't know where I was 90% of the time because we didn't have cell phones. I mean, you know, and again, this is like old person sharing that story. But I think what this generation, you know, I don't want to say that they're lost. I don't want to say that we should give up on them. But this morning, you know, I do career fairs for high school kids. I'll be invited and I'll go and I'll talk about what it's like to be an attorney and how, you know, you can do all kinds of different things as an attorney. And I work for the state and I do a lot of child welfare. And that's not like most people think of attorneys as contracts and money. And, and I had one student reach out to me. I always give them my business cards with my email address. And I had one student reach out to me about a week and a half ago. And his email to me was very text-like. And it just hit me wrong. There was no greeting. And it was basically like, hey, and it was not sup, but it was basically sup, can we talk about an internship possibility? Yeah. No sign, no thank you, no whatever. And I responded back, you know, professionally and said, you know, we don't really do internships for high school kids, but if you ever want to shadow me, let me know. And then he responded back, but I'm 18. I was like, there's still no context. There's no, and I was like, congratulations, but we don't do interns. Like usually has to be college, whatever. And then he sent it, and it was like a text exchange. And finally I was like, listen, this is completely unsolicited. And you're probably going to think I'm an old person and you're never going to respond to me again. But when you're emailing someone and asking them for the potential for either a job or an internship or something, use a greeting. Tell them why you're interested in learning more from them, and then sign it. Never heard from the kid again. Yeah. This morning, I got an email from a different high school student at a different high school, and it was like a breath of fresh air. I don't know if she used AI. If she did, God bless AI, and that it was exactly what you would want to see from, I would expect it to be written by a college kid, and she was a high school kid saying, I'm really interested. She was showing that she remembered who I was specifically, like that wasn't just an attorney that might have a paid internship for her. And it was like, what, and I looked at it in that moment and I was like, I'm not going to blame the kid. I'm going to blame a little bit maybe like the teachers and the parents, and are we failing at teaching them how to interact at a professional level? And when I was reading your stuff, you know, you have that model, the engaged empathy model, and I was like, I think that would be great to kind of not only teach to employers but also to kind of teach to the kids, to Gen Z, and say, listen, you know, when you're communicating with an older professional, they still expect greetings and they still expect professional language. It's not LOL, you know, text culture. And I think that, to me, that would make a lot of difference. And I wonder if we're going to say that even more, like Gen Alpha, with AI being much more prevalent, are they even going to know how to have those discussions in person?
I know. And it's so interesting what you said, because what you did by responding in that way is absolutely, I think, incredible, because essentially you probably very likely may have been the first person, and because I see this all the time, right? Even at the, maybe not, well, actually, I will say, I mean, I receive emails from students sometimes, especially at the freshman level, that are very much in that vein, right? And what you did is you let that person, that you know, adult really, but somewhat, I would say, know that this is how it is, and that's what we're seeing, right? We're seeing the problem is we want to blame, right? We want to push blame on the students, on the young cohort, the youngest cohort, whatever you want to call them, Gen Z, but the question is, were they ever taught these things?
Right.
Were they ever taught these things? And if they weren't, right? Because if they were sort of, I hate the word coddled, because I think that's a little bit too far.
Right.
But if there was a lot of that hand holding, and I saw that as a millennial, I mean, my parents weren't like that, but a lot of parents, I think, in that it was definitely a thing in that era, right? And it probably has been throughout, but definitely way more prevalent now, right? And so I think that just they don't know. Right. And so I know this is a little bit different from the market basket thing, but I think
I totally went off, but
I think it does tie in though, because again, the question is, where are they at in terms of thinking, right? And if they are not, for example, maybe perhaps this could be beneficial for a potential strike. And when I mean a walkout, because for example, are they aware of sort of the consequences? Because like, as we know, last time, it was not a strike because they're not in a union, right? So that becomes, are they sort of aware of those differences? Not that everyone, would be, and if the older generations aren't communicating that to them like they were last time, then what happens there? So I feel like there's and then you bring up the AI, which is a whole nother thing because people get mad at that, but at least it's helping. Right. If nobody else is going to teach, then maybe AI has to. Right. So, so maybe we'll have what was the maid on the Jetsons, Rosie.
Oh, Rosie. Yeah.
Maybe we'll have a Rosie teaching the kids.
Is it true that we've already surpassed the Jetsons? I think was like set in 2024 or something crazy like that.
Absolutely.
We don't have flying cars.
Yeah, but we don't. But I mean, I'm just saying that. I mean, we may have to have someone like that because otherwise, how are we going to learn? Because I don't think, and I'm not an expert in K through 12, but I don't think the same. I know when I was, a senior, we were being taught maybe how to like balance a checkbook. We had like I think it was called like a senior math class, but really realistically, that was it. I mean, we didn't have any sort of professional type courses. Even people have argued, home ec, of course, is no longer shops, these sorts of things. So the question becomes, where are these skills? They don't just fall out of the sky onto these young people.
Yeah.
So.
No, and I think it would be a great exercise. I mean, my daughter's a freshman in high school and she's taking Intro to Personal Finance. And so I've been very interested in, okay, what are you actually learning? Yeah. And she's telling me things like credit scores and I'm like, that's great. Finally, like because balancing a checkbook, no one does it anymore, right? It's all online and no one does it. So to teach that, although historically might make sense to pay attention to your money, at least, they're now, and I don't understand why every child doesn't graduate high school knowing how to write a resume and how to interview. And, I think and I don't know. And again, we could talk all day because I wonder what the COVID impact is and what the political impact is, because 2014 was a different political climate than 2025, right? And 2014 was pre-COVID, before we knew what could really happen if the world shuts down, versus 2025. So I think there's a lot of other factors. But one of the things I did want to ask you as well, because I think one of the other interesting parts of the Demoulas market basket controversy that I'm not sure is being discussed is, as I said, it's an $8 billion company with 90 stores. And, RDT, if I'm learning my history correctly, he's kind of the third generation of the family to be at the helm, right? And part of the conflict currently is his succession planning. He wants to include his children. And it sounds like maybe the sisters don't agree with that, or they would want other children involved. So with the Gen Z, with kind of this next iteration, with the fourth generation market basket succession planning, do you think it would be helpful for that generation to kind of step forward and engage the Gen Z employees to say, this is what it's going to look like going forward, instead of talking so much about this is what it has been and this is the tradition? I'm just kind of curious, do you think, when you said at the end that things are going to be different this time around, do you see that as a possibility of a difference that it could be?
I think so. I think possibly it would be very interesting. One of the things that when I spoke to Generation Z workers, was that they did not view this as working at Market Basket as a long-term possibility. And we know, and I know this, I have family members that have done this. Market Basket, at least historically, has been a very lucrative possibility for long-time work. I mean, certainly out of the ordinary for, the grocery industry, right? Extremely out of the ordinary. And many people I've known, and probably you've known, and anyone listening have known people that have worked their way from a 14-year-old bagger to, whatever,
manager,
or even in the executive suite and all these things. And I think that was part of their story for so long. And I don't think, at least again, from what my interactions were, that they view it that way. They view it as the more traditional, I'm going to do this for now, and then I'm going to move on. Right. So I think maybe there could be, whether it's introducing, I don't know if they have the same sort of draw that their father seems to have, right, on people, the charisma, the sort of down to earth, if so, maybe that would work if they could connect. I don't know how old they are. I don't know sort of how, that could work. But I still wonder if the messaging has to be different. Right. Because, and it has to be, this is how we're going to take care of you sort of now, or this is what and sort of laying out what the future is going to look like. Because if they don't believe now that they're going to work there and, have a career there, 40 years, you retire and the whole, stock and everything that's part of it, if they don't even see that as being on the table because that's not their plan, then I don't know if the same, why rally around someone that, something that's sort of exactly.
Do you think any Gen Z takes a job thinking it's their full life
well,
job?
That's the other thing. I don't think so anymore.
I feel like that mindset has changed as well.
I mean, I don't think I have that mindset anymore. I think that, somewhere along the line, we talk a lot about the idea of job hopping, and it used to be seen as so, as a negative thing, right? If it wasn't like 5 years or more, then. But I think when you ask Gen Z, and even millennials, but specifically Gen Z, they don't think anything of it.
Right.
And I don't blame them. I don't think anything of it, right? Because they don't have that same, at least again, statistically, they don't seem to have that same, feel that same loyalty. And why would they? Right. I mean, if you think about how some of the interactions we've been talking about, right, then they don't seem to have that. And when in such uncertain times, I feel like the fantasy of, graduating from college, getting a degree, maybe going to grad school, whatever it might be, getting a job, working 40 years, retiring, and, living in the house with a white picket fence and all those things, which is just, all, I mean, don't get me wrong. I love the idea of retro Americana. It's lovely. But the truth is it's not realistic, right? And so why would they feel that way?
Right.
But maybe there's potential for the younger generation to come in, like you said, and try to convince them.
Right.
Because it is Market Basket's a great place to work by all accounts. I've known lots of people that have done, better than me.
And that's when you would hope that the older generations that are still working there would remind them, hey, when this strike ended, this is how RDT treated us and treated the customers. I mean, I remember, wasn't it like for a year that there was like a 10% discount off of all of the groceries or it was like something crazy to thank the customers for their support. And I was amazed. I had a client a million years ago who worked at the warehouse, and he would say how they get every time a new store open, they would all get a bonus. So even like the full-time warehouse employees were included in that. And I think maybe, because I do think Gen Z, you kind of touched upon it earlier when you said like they're asking for more, right? They're kind of expecting more. And I think part of that is I blame social media for it, because I will use the word blame, because I do think my children have some unrealistic expectations as to what should be happening immediately versus what you work towards. And I do think it's because we live in a society now where you can, this could go on YouTube and go viral, and all of a sudden, Jeff LeBlanc is being asked to be interviewed by like a national, a national situation, right? Because that's all it takes is you go viral and you get monetized by your sponsorships and things like, you know what I mean? And that's the world we live in. And I say that ironically, I'm doing a podcast with you right now, so I understand how it works, and I'm part of it. But I do think that the behind the scenes stuff, I think kids today don't necessarily know that, and I wish I could remember which celebrity it was that he said, he's an overnight sensation and it took him 20 years, Right. And I think that's what's lost a little bit. And I think because we have the social media where you can edit and you can kind of filter and make it look like it was as easy as just sitting down with a guitar and all of a sudden you're Justin Bieber, I don't think is necessarily, realistic. And I do think it does worry me about this generation that they're demanding, not, I shouldn't say demanding, because that sounds more judgy than I'm trying to be right now, that they're expecting to get rewarded for very minor, accolades, for lack of a better word. They're not putting 100% of the work in for as long as you would expect, and they're expecting, but they're getting it. I mean, I think that's the interesting part of this is, with the job hopping, you stop a job hopper by saying, I'm not going to hire you because you've had 4 jobs in the last 5 years. Yeah. They're still getting employed, right? Yeah. So obviously the culture is shifting in that's no longer the red flag that it used to be for employees. And I think that's interesting. I think Market Basket, the ultimate question, what I'm curious about is 20 years from now, when we're talking about Market Basket, is it going to look the same? Because right now it's like, just, as a point of reference, they don't have self-checkout. Yep. And I love that about them, right? Yep. They still want you to have that human interaction when you walk into a grocery store. You don't know where something is. You ask a kid with a blue apron on where to find it, and they tell you. And most Market Baskets are laid out that you kind of have a general idea, right? Yeah. Because it's that familiarity. And it looks the same, even when they renovate them. They look very much the same as they did, back in 1990 when I was, working there or whatever. And 20 years later, from now, and if we have this conversation in 2045, will that all be able to be said? Or will it have gone the way of, being modern and the employees there being okay with it, but kind of us looking at it and missing a different time?
Yeah. And I think that's what we don't know. One of the things that I've repeatedly said is that I personally think that they're perhaps looking at taking Market Basket public, right? And going public, and then therefore everything changes, right? I mean, the money, of course, will be great for those that are, for everyone involved in the family. It'll be less hands-on, but they're going to have to answer to those, to those shareholders, and which means prices are naturally going to go up. And that also means that the same employee type, compensation and bonuses, and most of that's just going to go away, right? It's going to turn into like a Shaw's or, a Star Market, these places. And I don't know, again, that's their business choice, right? In terms of strategy, what works for them. But again, if that's sort of where they're headed, then, I don't know if, someone like an RDT can hold on for how long, eventually, if everybody's sort of on board with the going public situation. But I love what you mentioned about, in terms of, sort of getting what with the Gen Z, sort of getting what they want or whatever it may be. And that's what I talk about, not to talk about the model, but when I talk about the engaged empathy leadership model, one of the things that I talk about is, how, because one thing I've noticed is that I do think that younger people do respond well. I think we all do, to kindness. Yep. But I think that the other two sort of pillars of my model are fairness and structure. And I think the reason being is because I think that, just because you want something, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's time. And that's why being very fair and having these guidelines, and also having some sort of structure that's clear in terms of what, that employee, sort of is expected to do, and what sort of and I think Market Basket historically has done, it seems like, a tremendous job at all three of those things.
Right.
So in some ways, my question would kind of be, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Right. And maybe they can convince a generation who's unsure about what comes next, right? Well, they could convince them, we come next, right? We can be here for you. We can stay and be that family, like you said, family feel. 1990s, you're right. I mean, and it's fine. Yeah. Doesn't need to. And they have expanded. I mean, they have there's so many things, right? The in-store dining options and all this, and I know
Market
people who
kitchen.
Exactly right, and
Market Basket spirits, right?
And with such a brand, so I think maybe this is an opportunity for them to say you're right. Like you said before, the younger or even RDT himself, or the sister, anyone, right?
Right.
Say, look, let's convince this generation and let's sort of keep this going, because they're in they have a rare opportunity to do that. But if that's not their strategy and their end goal, then I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, and I think, when I was talking about this idea and preparing for today, I was talking to some friends about this who I would consider, my generation, maybe a little bit younger than me, maybe like borderline millennial, Gen X. And one of the things that one of my friends said that I thought was really smart and important to note is, I don't think this time around there's a clear-cut leader. And I do think, especially for Gen Z, for all generations, but I think for Gen Z, they want to know, they want to hear from someone in a leadership role to kind of give them guidance. And they might not follow it, but I think right now, we're having roofing work done, and the contractor yesterday, I walked up the sidewalk with a Market Basket bag, and he yells down from the ladder, "Are they on strike yet?" And I'm like, "I have no idea, Sean. I don't think so. Everything
that we know of."
Right. And so I think this time around, it seems like, last time it was very clear. RDT was the leader that everyone was supporting, and the messaging was kind of coming through. If you believe in him and you believe in the everyman and you believe in the customer focus, that's where you go. And this time, I don't feel like this kind of conflict yet has a true leader, because he's not even fired, right? He's out on paid leave. So when you read about it, it's very like wishy-washy as to, what are they even planning on doing with him? And is he really going to be gone, or is it more succession planning that there's a conflict that's going to take years in the boardroom to kind of figure out? So I mean, this is just a layperson, having a conversation with some friends. What do you think Gen Z looks at to kind of that corporate leadership, other than not, knowing a name or a face necessarily, but how do you feel like their messaging gets to them in the best way?
Well, I think that, what I notice, one of the things that gives me the most hope, right, for this generation and for us in general as people, is that when I talk to Gen Z, whether it's students, whether it's the employees, whether it's whoever it is, right, one of the things, and there was a quote that I loved, and I'm paraphrasing from the article, where essentially they said, they really, one of the things that they think about is they think about the community, and they think about, so I'm from Haverhill, right, and in Haverhill, we have 3 Market Baskets, and they're the only grocery stores in the community. And which means that the elderly and the people that can't make it, in other ways, or sort of that are going to be, really challenged, like they were in 2014, by if this happens. And when, I sort of discuss that with them, and one of the things they say is that, they really care about that. They really care about the community, and they care about the fact that, there wouldn't be an option for the elderly, or, their customers who they see all the time that come in, that wouldn't have that option. We're living through a very difficult time economically, right? So, and Market Basket's prices are very affordable. So they're concerned about that, and the other thing they mention is their love and their sort of they're the coworkers that they're friendly with, right? And how they really sort of do feel a bond there. So, again, we were talking about maybe there isn't some of that, but it seems like at least generationally, the ones that are close, right, to the same age have that. So I think that the same things are all there, just sort of repackaged in a way, right? And so I don't know, again, if the goal is to avoid a walkout, then I think all the, corporate can really sort of talk a little bit about these things that really do resonate with, it's a human thing, right? It's not just, so people can say what they want about Gen Z, but these, the common decent things were still coming through. If not, if anything, I'd say more so, right, from this generation, whether people want to, admit that or not. And so, but if the goal is, a walkout, if it gets to a point where, that's maybe he is fired or whatever could happen, right? Then I wonder sort of if they jump on board on a walkout, not because of RDT per se, right? But because of these community
The community.
factors.
That makes sense.
And I think that there was some of that in 2014, but the story was the workers rally behind this CEO, and it
Right.
was such an amazing story. This time, I just don't see that based on what I've been hearing and who I've talked to with the younger, employees. But I do think that the generation could rally behind, well, this is for our community and this is for the values that we believe in, which I think is really cool if you think about
Yeah.
it. So that's, yeah.
No, I love that. And I appreciate you saying that, because I do think that gets lost, because I think sometimes we're looking at Gen Z for kind of like what their self-advocacy is and labeling it as selfish, and we're not looking at, but they're not just stopping at themselves usually, right?
Absolutely.
Hopefully. And most of the time that there's still, that exists still.
Yeah.
So before we finish, I did want, because I noticed that you're publishing a book.
I am.
And I wanted to
yes.
give you an opportunity to plug it and to tell me a little bit more about it, because I'm definitely interested in reading it. I graduated from Bentley a million years ago, and that was, I think, why we had the LinkedIn connection. So I'm kind of like, I love reading business stuff, even though I'm not necessarily in that world anymore. I'm more like child welfare world. So you said a little bit at the beginning about being a lecturer and kind of an academic, and really finding this work interesting. And I do think it's going to be very important, given that you're basically telling us, telling the older generations, this is what this next generation workforce is coming in. This is what you need to do to engage it effectively. Tell me a little bit about your book.
Yeah, and so I would say that I'm sort of an accidental academic in the sense that it was never necessarily the plan. I worked in radio right after undergrad.
Okay.
But ultimately, this is a culmination of all the research I've done, and I would say that it is not necessarily an academic book. It's not necessarily. It is a business book in the sense that it's hopefully readers and and employers sort of respond to it and it resonates with them. But I think it could be for anyone. And it's the idea that sort of the engaged empathy, like I said, the idea around those 3 pillars and how we can use those three pillars to really, improve retention and improve efficiency and all the things that we want out of our employees, or even just out of ourselves, right? And there's a lot of case study information in there about situations that I've actually worked with individuals. There's some stories that I just tell because I'm a little bit of a storyteller. So there's that in there as well. There is some research for the people that want the research. It's at the very end. So if anyone wants to skip that part, you can skip it but if you want to. Some people love numbers.
Right.
That's going to be there. And hopefully, it just provides an opportunity to think a little bit about not just retaining young employees, but how we can make the workplace a little bit better for everyone. That's really what the goal is. So
That's great. Well, Jeff LeBlanc, thank you so much for coming today to the WellPoint Studios.
Thanks
Teddy
for having
Panners,
me.
thank you for producing today. He wouldn't let me push any buttons, so we're going to leave that joke alone. And thank you, InsideLowell. I look forward to seeing you guys soon.